The clock above the station arch ticked with a peculiar rhythm, as if it kept its own secret time. Lysander Quill stood beneath it, suitcase in hand, eyes fixed on the brass hands that moved almost imperceptibly forward. He wasn't here for the train, not yet, but for the envelope promised to arrive by courier at precisely noon. The air was thick with the scent of coal smoke and rain-washed stone. Conductors called out destinations in quick, clipped tones. Vendors wheeled carts of roasted chestnuts between the throngs. Somewhere, a violinist was playing a tune so light it seemed to float above the noise. Lysander checked his pocket watch. 11:59. His heart gave a small, anticipatory jolt. The courier appeared as if conjured, a boy in a navy cap, rein on his shoulders, holding a long, slender parcel wrapped in waxed paper. "For you, sir," the boy said, and vanished into the crowd before Lysander could speak. Inside was not a letter, but a map, hand-drawn, its lines precise yet strangely alive, as though the ink still shimmered. In the corner, where a signature might be, was only the outline of a key. No words, no directions, just that silent symbol. Lysander had seen it once before. Years ago, in his grandfather's attic, carved into the lid of a wooden chest that no one could open. The chest had disappeared soon after, along with the man himself. A thin slip of paper fluttered out from between the map's folds. It read, "Begin where the tides speak twice a day." The phrase curled in his mind like smoke. Twice a day, the tides. He thought instantly of Brackmere Bay, a place where the sea retreated so far at low tide that whole paths of rock were revealed, only to vanish beneath the waves hours later. But Brackmere was a day's journey north, and the map showed more than one location. A dotted line ran from the bay to the edges of the continent, across seas, mountains, and forests. It was no simple map. It was a plan. By the time the station bell rang the hour, Lysander had made his decision. He would follow the line. All of it. Whatever this key was, whether it opened a lock, a door, or something less tangible, it had waited long enough. He boarded the first train heading north, the map folded neatly in his pocket. Outside the window, the city's chimneys blurred into countryside. Hills rolled past like the slow turning of pages. And for the first time in years, he felt that rare spark in his chest, the one that only lit when something extraordinary was about to begin. At the far edge of the carriage, a woman in a traveling coat glanced at him over a book. She seemed to know something. But before Lysander could speak to her, the train plunged into a tunnel, and the world outside vanished into darkness. Emerged from the tunnel, the light had shifted, softer now, as though the clouds had been brushed across the sun. The woman across the carriage still watched him, her book closed in her lap. "You've folded it wrong," she said suddenly. Lysander blinked. "Pardon." "The map," she clarified, with a nod to his jacket pocket. "It creases over the northern routes. That makes the lines harder to follow." He hesitated, then pulled it free. "You know this map." "I know its kind," she said, sliding into the seat opposite his. "Hand-inked by chart-makers who worked for the old guilds. They drew more than geography, they drew intent. See here," she pointed to a tiny mark along the coastline. "This is a tide gate. At Brackmere Bay, if I'm not mistaken." That startled him. "You're correct." "How?" "Because I've been through it," she replied, almost matter-of-factly. "Twice a day the water reveals a stone arch. At the arch's heart, you'll find your first clue. Before he could question her further, the conductor's call rang down the aisle. Brackmere! Next stop. The bay lay wide and glistening under the gray sky, the tide already pulling away to bare the rippled sand. Gull cries echoed over the flats. The woman, who had introduced herself simply as Maribel, led him down a path fringed with sea thrift and wind-bent grass. The stone arch appeared exactly as she'd said, a natural curve worn smooth by centuries of waves. From afar it seemed empty, but stepping beneath it revealed something remarkable, a pattern of grooves carved into the stone floor, shaped like the same key from his map's corner. Maribel knelt and brushed sand from the grooves. These aren't just markings. They're a sundial, but they'll only tell the hour when the tide reaches a certain line. They waited as the water crept in, slow and deliberate. When it touched the innermost mark, the afternoon sun broke through the clouds, striking the arch in such a way that a faint shimmer glowed on the opposite cliff face. There, Maribel said. Your next point. It was nearly 2 miles along the shore, and they walked quickly, the tide pressing in behind them. At the cliff's base they found a narrow stair cut into the rock, half hidden by ferns. The air smelled faintly of salt and moss. At the top stood a small, weathered hut, no larger than a single room. Inside, the dust of long disuse swirled in their footsteps. Against the far wall sat an oak chest bound with tarnished brass. Lysander's pulse quickened. But there was no lock, only an indentation where something key-shaped might fit. Maribel smiled faintly. Looks like you're not the first to come searching. But perhaps you'll be the first to leave with it. From outside, the low boom of the returning tide echoed like a distant drum. The chest's surface was cool under Lysander's fingertips, the wood worn smooth by age. The indentation in the brass gleamed faintly, as though it had been polished more recently than the rest of the metal. Someone had been here, not long ago. Maribel crouched to inspect it. This isn't a simple lock, she murmured. It's a resonance seal. You'll need the right object, placed here, while a certain tone is sounded. He frowned. And how do we find that? She glanced toward the map he still held. Sometimes the answer is on paper. Sometimes it's in the air. They spread the map on the hut's narrow table. Near the symbol for Brackmere Bay was another, a spiral drawn beside a cliff icon. Maribel tapped it. That's a wind chamber. When the tide's high, the air pushes through the rock, and if you're standing in just the right spot, the sound can make your bones vibrate. They left the hut and followed a jagged path along the cliff. The sea had surged high now, foaming at the rocks below. Soon they came upon the opening, a narrow fissure where the wind hissed, then howled as each wave struck. Lysander stepped closer, and the tone shifted, low, resonant, almost like the hum of a glass rim being rubbed. He could feel it in his ribs. That's it, Maribel said. Now, we need the object. They searched the ground, peering among the tide pools and slick stones. It was Maribel who spotted it, a small disk of metal, no larger than a pocket watch, half buried in wet sand. Engraved upon it was the key symbol, identical to the one on the map. Back at the hut, they fitted the disk into the indentation. Lysander braced his hand on the chest, and Maribel nodded. Ready. The seal will only open while the sound lasts. Once it fades. She hurried back to the fissure, positioning herself so the wind chamber's tone filled the air. Lysander felt the vibration again as he pressed the disk. A soft click. Then another. The chest's lid rose just enough for his fingers to lift it fully. Inside was no treasure, only a bundle of rolled parchment tied with green ribbon, and beneath it, a small brass compass unlike any he'd seen. The face had no north, only a single arrow, trembling faintly, pointing somewhere beyond the open sea. Mirabelle returned, breathing quickly. "What's inside?" "A compass," he said, "but it doesn't point to north." She smiled faintly. "Then it's not meant for navigation. Not the usual kind, anyway." They studied the parchments together. The first roll contained sketches of coastlines and mountains Lysander had never seen. The second was stranger still, diagrams of what looked like mechanical doors set into natural formations, caves, arches, even the roots of massive trees. Each bore the key symbol. The final page was the simplest. A single line of ink, follow until it stops. Lysander looked again at the compass. The arrow had begun to tremble more violently, as if urging them onward. "We'll need a ship," he said. Mirabelle's eyes lit. "I know a captain who owes me a favor." Somewhere beyond the horizon, the arrow's unseen destination waited, and the first step toward it would carry them far from the familiar shores of Brackmere Bay. The harbor of Westwater smelled of tar, brine, and salt-worn rope. Ships rocked gently in their moorings, their masts etching dark lines against the morning haze. Mirabelle led Lysander along the creaking planks of the pier toward a modest brigantine with a hull painted the color of old parchment. Its name, Sea Whisper, was lettered in fading gold. The captain was a wiry man named Corin Vale, his skin weathered by years at sea. "Mirabelle!" he exclaimed, clasping her hands in a greeting that was half embrace, half business transaction. "And who's this?" "A passenger," Mirabelle said, "with a destination only a compass can tell." Corin's gaze flicked to the odd brass instrument Lysander carried. "Strange piece. Doesn't read north, does it?" "No," Lysander admitted. "It points elsewhere." Corin shrugged. "Elsewhere is where I've spent my life. You've got coin or trade." Mirabelle produced a small satchel of polished shells and carved driftwood. Corin examined them, smiled, and gestured them aboard. "You'll have your passage. But where elsewhere leads is your own affair." The Sea Whisper left the harbor at first tide, its sails catching the wind in a lazy billow that soon grew taut and eager. Lysander stood at the prow, watching the compass arrow quiver and settle, guiding them southeast into open water. The mainland dwindled into a smudge on the horizon. Days passed with the rhythm of the sea, gulls at dawn, the creak of timbers, the slap of waves against the hull. Mirabelle taught Lysander to read the stars, tracing constellations whose shapes she claimed matched places on old guild maps. Corin spoke little of their course, but watched the compass with growing curiosity. On the fourth morning, mist closed around them like a curtain. The sea became a dull mirror, the sails hanging slack. The compass arrow spun once, twice, then locked firmly toward a patch of fog so dense it seemed to have weight. "We're entering the reefless belt," Corin warned. "No landmarks. Currents change without warning. Sailors say things are different there." As they drifted in, sound itself seemed muffled. Footsteps on the deck fell silent. The water had no scent, the air no taste. Lysander felt as though they had stepped outside the ordinary world. The fog thinned suddenly, revealing an island so small it barely deserved the name, a ring of pale sand around a single stone monolith. The compass arrow pointed straight at it. They rowed ashore, the sand cool underfoot despite the midday light. The monolith was carved with spirals and arcs, forming a pattern that almost resembled a map. At its base lay a shallow basin filled with perfectly clear water. Maribel knelt beside it, touching the surface. "It's fresh," she said in surprise. "And it's flowing from somewhere inside the stone." When Lysander held the compass over the basin, the arrow dipped downward, as if pointing into the water itself. He stared at the basin's smooth bottom, until he realized it wasn't stone at all, but glass, and beneath it, something gleamed faintly. Corin tapped the glass with his knuckle. "Not breaking that without tools. If you want what's under there, you'll have to find another way." Maribel studied the monolith's carvings. "These spirals, they look like currents. I think they describe the tides in this area." She traced her finger to a mark shaped like a crescent moon. At a certain lunar phase, the water may drop low enough to reach inside. Lysander's mind raced. "And when's the next phase?" Corin looked skyward. 2 nights. But the belt's currents shift. Staying anchored here won't be easy. 2 nights at an island where the sea itself seemed uncanny, waiting for a moment that might reveal, or hide forever, the next step of their journey. Anchoring at the tiny ring of sand proved trickier than Corin had warned. The currents didn't push so much as drift sideways, as if the sea had forgotten which way was down. Twice the sea whisper swung around its line like a weather vane with no wind, and twice Corin adjusted the rigging with a patience born of long habit. By evening, the brigantine held steady, facing the monolith like a respectful listener. They kept a quiet watch. The island had no birds, no crabs, no scurrying shapes at dusk, only the hush of water and the faintest thrumming from within the stone. Maribel sat on the thwart of the skiff with the guild map spread across her knees, comparing the monolith spirals to the inked curls on paper. "Not just tides," she said at last, tapping a coil cut deep into the stone. "These are phase marks. The basin isn't a pool, it's a measure. When the moon tips the balance, the level inside changes, by inches, not feet." She glanced toward the sky, where a pale crescent floated like a chalk smudge. "Tomorrow night, just before the moon sets." Lysander slept lightly and dreamed of hourglasses turned by the sea. At dawn, he woke to a subtle glow along the waterline, a ribbon of light that rode the swell but never broke. He leaned over the rail and saw the source, tiny organisms flaring with each ripple. The belt had its own quiet fireworks. They filled the waiting hours with small tasks. Corin showed Lysander how to splice rope so neatly the join was invisible. Maribel fashioned a rough caliper from 2 whittled slats to gauge the basin's change. The compass lay on the deck between them, its single arrow obeying no cardinal law and yet perfectly sure of itself, quivering toward the island as if impatient. Night returned, crisp and clear. The stars swarmed close. The moon hung lower, thinner. They rowed ashore and set the caliper's crude arms across the basin. The fresh water inside was so clear the black of the sky seemed to sink into it. A film of chill crept through Lysander's sleeves. "It's falling," Maribel whispered. The wooden arms ticked down a fraction. Then another. Beneath the glass, the faint gleam resolved into a ring laid flat, a narrow annulus of brass, etched with numbers too small to read through the pane. A seam ran around the glass's edge, almost invisible, sealed with a pitch that time had hardened smooth. "Not breaking," Corin repeated, squinting. "But seams are promises." Maribel shaded the basin with her body and held the guild map's waxed edge over the seam. "Pitch softens with warmth," she murmured. "And the belt's nights are cold. We'll need the day." They waited through the last of the dark, then welcomed the first light as if it were a craftsman. When the sun cleared the low horizon, Lysander fetched the polished lid of a lantern and, with careful hands, angled it to throw a small, steady bar of brightness along the seam. The pitch did not melt so much as loosen its pride. Maribel slid the tip of a marlinspike beneath the lip. The glass lifted with a delicate sigh, like a jar releasing a hidden scent. No alarm sounded, no secret springs snapped. Some puzzles preferred courtesy to force. The annulus lay in the dry, its engraving crisp and fine. Inside the ring, 3 hairline pointers could be nudged to different marks. Along the outer edge, a shallow dovetail suggested it was meant to marry another device. Lysander didn't need the hint. The compass in his pocket felt suddenly heavier, as if paying attention. He set the annulus over the compass. It settled with the quiet rightness of a last piece completing a pattern. The single arrow on the face shifted, paused, and, astonishingly, split into 3 fainter threads radiating from the same pivot, each thread aligning with one of the ring's tiny pointers. 3 bearings, Corin breathed. But to what? Maribel adjusted the ring until a small symbol engraved between 2 ticks, an hourglass without sand, aligned with the boldest thread. The compass answered by stilling entirely, its quiver gone. A moment later it began again, faintly, as if deciding. Lysander lifted it toward the open sea. The bold thread leaned west by south, not toward empty water now, but toward something beyond the fog's farther wall. The second thread drifted inland, as if pointing at a shore not yet under their feet. The third lay nearly across the other 2, aiming north with such hesitance it felt like a suggestion rather than a command. "Listen," Maribel said, as if to the instrument. "One path at a time." She tapped the symbol of the hourglass. "When this is set, it chooses urgency." "West-south," Corin decided. "And soon, before the belt grows stubborn." They shipped the glass safely, resealed the basin without ceremony. It felt right to restore the place exactly as they had found it, and pushed off. The fog received them with indifferent arms. The sea whisper rounded the island and found a wind where no pennant stirred. Sails filled. The belt let them pass like a thought it had finally finished thinking. Days reassembled themselves from mist and rope and gull cries. With the annulus fitted, the compass behaved like a conversation, sometimes decisive, sometimes contemplative. At dawn it would lock and settle, allowing Corin to choose attack. By noon it would lean a degree, then another, as if sampling the air. Twice it went still so completely that the captain ordered the crew to heave to and let the world catch up. On the 7th dawn after leaving the island, the fog fractured into blue. A low coast unfurled ahead, a necklace of dunes, then green beyond. The bold thread on the compass aligned with a broad estuary curling into the land like a welcome. Corin turned the brigantine's nose toward it. They entered the river on a flood tide that rolled beneath them like a long, slow breath. On the left bank, warehouses rose on pilings. On the right, gardens terraced down to the water. Lanterns hung unlit along a quay, and wooden signs creaked in a friendly language of trade: rope, grain, paper, salt. The city announced itself with an easy cheer. A pennant at the harbor office named it Port Kestrel. The compass's bold thread, for the first time since the belt, began to lean inland without wavering. Lysander felt the shift in his bones. The journey would continue by earth and stone. They disembarked with thanks and a payment generous enough to erase any lingering suspicion that elsewhere had wasted Corin's time. The captain gripped Lysander's forearm. "When the sea is part of your road again," he said, "look for sails the color of parchment." Mirabelle traded shells for a tidy folio of rail tickets and a hand-drawn coach schedule. "The river forks," she told Lysander as they crossed a footbridge, the boards singing softly under their steps. "The guild maps call the left branch the Silverway. The right vanishes into uplands labeled only with a dotted oval and the note, 'Echoes kept here.'" She smiled, not unkindly. "We've been chasing echoes since Brackmere." They took a narrow-gauge train out of Port Kestrel, the car no larger than a parlor, with lace curtains and a coal stove that ticked contentedly. Fields streamed by, then orchards, then hills whose flanks wore stripes of slate and fern. At each stop, the compass pointed not to the station but to the horizon beyond it, faithful as a migratory path. Near dusk, the tracks ran out at a town with more sheep than streets. A coach waited, its lamps already lit, and the driver touched his cap when Mirabelle showed him the dotted oval on the map. "Up to the ringing stones," he said. "You'll hear them before you see them." The road climbed in careful switchbacks. The air thinned and sweetened. Stars came early. Somewhere ahead, a faint hum threaded the night, too steady for wind, too round for insect song. The coach topped a rise, and the land opened into a high, shallow basin rimmed with dark pillars. Even in starlight, Lysander saw that the pillars were not trees but columns of basalt, sprung from the earth like a frozen choir. The hum deepened. The compass, in his palm, ceased trembling and went still as a held breath. Mirabelle stepped down first. "It's stopping," she said softly. "Which means—" Lysander followed her gaze. On the far side of the basin, where the columns thinned, a natural aperture framed the sky, an enormous keyhole of stone. Beyond it, the first edge of the moon lifted, laying a path of silver across the grass. "The last door," Mirabelle whispered. "And it opens outward." The compass did not contradict her. It simply rested, poised at the threshold where road became answer. The basin of ringing stones was quiet, but for the hum that seemed to come from the earth itself. Each basalt column thrummed faintly when touched, the vibration lingering in the fingertips like the memory of a note. Lysander stepped between them, careful not to disturb the symmetry of their arrangement. The compass lay steady in his hand, arrow fixed toward the vast keyhole-shaped opening on the far side. Beyond that aperture, the rising moon glowed brighter, bathing the grass in a pale wash of silver. Mirabelle walked a pace ahead, eyes roaming the stones as if searching for something left behind by centuries past. "This place," she murmured, "wasn't built to keep people out. It was built to teach them when to arrive." As they drew closer to the opening, the hum shifted in tone, higher now, almost melodic. Lysander noticed the air felt warmer, despite the mountain night. The basalt on either side of the aperture carried carved lines, not straight but gently spiraling inward, meeting at the narrow waist of the keyhole. At its very base sat a stone plinth no higher than his knee. And on that plinth, set into a shallow recess, was a disk of polished quartz the size of his palm. Its surface was smooth except for one etched mark, the same key symbol that had followed them since the map's first appearance. Mirabelle glanced at the compass. "If this is truly the last step, it won't be about direction anymore. It'll be about recognition." Lysander knelt, lifting the quartz. It caught the moonlight, scattering it in a faint prism across the grass. The hum from the stones swelled until it seemed to fill his chest. Without knowing exactly why, he placed the quartz into the very center of the compass's brass ring. The change was immediate. The 3 faint threads of the compass's arrow dissolved, replaced by a single beam of light, not painted on glass, but rising from the instrument itself, straight upward through the keyhole aperture toward the moon. For a heartbeat, the whole basin glowed as if lit from within, each basalt column resonating in harmony. Maribel shielded her eyes, smiling. "It's answering." The beam faded slowly, and when it was gone, the compass looked entirely different. The brass was brighter, the single arrow now resting dead center, unmoving, as if it had finished all the work it had ever been asked to do. "What now?" Lysander asked. "Now," Maribel said, "you decide what the key is for. Because it's never just a lock. It's a choice." They walked back through the columns, the hum returning to its softer undertone. At the basin's rim, Lysander turned for one last look at the keyhole of stone. The moon was higher now, and from this angle the aperture framed not just the night sky but the distant glint of water, a river catching moonlight far below. By morning, they were descending the mountain path toward the valley. The compass no longer pulled or trembled, yet Lysander felt no loss. The journey itself had become the destination, each place they'd crossed leaving its own quiet mark. At the river's edge, a small ferry waited, its lantern swaying in the breeze. The ferryman nodded as they stepped aboard, saying nothing, as though he'd been expecting them all along. The boat slid into the current, and the mountains behind them began to fade. Ahead, the river bent out of sight, carrying them toward lands not yet drawn on any map they owned. Maribel leaned on the railing, her voice just above the ripple of water. "We may never see where every thread leads. But some doors open simply because we went looking." Lysander looked at the compass one last time before slipping it into his coat. "Then let's keep looking." The ferry drifted onward, lantern light mingling with moonlight, both pointing toward whatever waited just beyond the bend.